Welcome to the online teaching ministry of Pastor Rob Ginter and Farmdale Baptist Church. For more content, visit us online at farmdalebaptist.com.
There certainly are, in these last two chapters, chapters 8 and 9 of Ecclesiastes, two thieves that are headed to your house. And they effectively break in because you are convinced that they're not close and they're not coming after you. You see, Solomon, a man on a relentless search to discover whether there is anything that matters under the sun, is highlighting these two thieves in these chapters. Because what you end up trying to do is build a huge bank account, fill your life with food, pleasure, comfort, achievement, enjoyment. You fill all of these things, but there's one problem. A thief comes when it's all over and takes it all away. And who is that thief? Death. Death. And you go, well, that makes sense. We dealt with death last week in chapter 9, verses 1 through 12, that death is something that comes to all of us, and it takes from all of us. That's certainly true. But now here in the passage beginning in verse 13 of Ecclesiastes chapter 9, we see a thief that's come into your house probably long before death gets there and robs from you. Who is that thief? Foolishness. Foolishness. Folly is the thief that drains your life while you are still living it. Folly is the thief that takes away from you while you have life. Death comes and erases the board, so to speak. But folly is a drain on it while you live. So you can chase, yes, pleasure, plan the perfect bucket list before death comes. You can do all of those things. You can try to squeeze all the goodness out of your life like it's a lemon. But if you play the fool, we begin to see here in chapter 9, verses 13 and following, that you'll be destroyed. You'll be destroyed by your own foolishness. So I said there's those two thieves, and they're coming to your house. One of them's death, and the other one's foolishness. So what do you do? What are you tempted to do? Well, you might be tempted to bunker down and play it safe, lest something you do be foolish. The scary thing about what we see here in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 through 13 is that folly thrives in what we perceive as safety, because there's risks that we ought to be taking with our lives to fully live it. The overarching point of this passage is that fools aren't always the only ones who risk, and you ought to root out the foolishness before you're ruined. Because, we look at people who are taking risks and we go, that is an absolute fool if I've ever seen one. Look how risky their behavior is. But what we see here in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 is that there are wise risks. And folly is there in safety. So Solomon illustrates this point beginning in chapter 9, verse 14. And he says, let me tell you a story about a town that had a king in it, and the small town is besieged by this powerful king, and they're outmatched and they're desperate, and the town is saved by a poor man who's wise, and he devised a plan against the conquering army to save the people. And yet, the twist in the story is that the people forgot all about their hero. They forgot all about the man. So Solomon contrasts this. Wisdom is better than strength, even if it's unrecognized. It's more powerful than a foolish ruler's shouts or an army's might. And he teaches this in the story of an underdog. Don't we love the underdog? And he says that understanding trumps raw power and resources. And then verse 18 delivers the sobering twist. Wisdom is better than weapons of war. But one sinner destroys much good. So just as one wise man can topple an army, just a little bit of foolishness in your life can absolutely destroy you. So we should root out foolishness by trimming ridiculousness. There's a synonym for us. And how do we do this? Or why do we do this? It's because folly is polluting. So folly destroys wisdom. That's why we do it. Because and you all know this. I'm not telling you something you don't know. You have built a life. You've built marriages. You've built relationships. You've built all of these things. And yet they can be fragile to one moment of foolishness. Imagine your spouse coming home and they say, honey, I have been 95% faithful to you today. And before you get stressed out, that is an A in every class that I've ever taken. That is considered an A in every school that I've ever been in. So I think for the purposes of our marriage, that my 95% faithfulness today should be considered an A. Would you ever have that conversation with your spouse? And if you're like, then you're the fool that we're talking about. Right? Like that's not, because that 5% is the things that nightmares are made of. What do you mean you've been 90? Figure it out, right? Let's bump that bad boy up, extra credit. You've been 99% faithful. What did you do today? Tell me what you did today. Don't give me math. Tell me what that 1% was. He gives an illustration of this, just a little bit of foolishness in our life, right? You see it in marriage because you're like, that foolish conversation about math was the beginning of a really follow-up, serious conversation that we had. Solomon gives another illustration of this. Chapter 10, verse 1, he illustrates this. Dead flies spoil fine perfume. This is a synonym of what's happening here. So a few dead flies spoil whatever they touch, right? And we don't have any, I don't know how many perfume connoisseurs we have over here. Some of you all smell nice, but I'm assuming that you're not perfume connoisseurs. So let's think about something here in honor of Thanksgiving. Mashed potatoes. Just a big old bowl of mashed potatoes, butter, and somebody put a little bit too much pepper in it. So you're looking at those mashed potatoes and you're like, those peppers are moving. The pepper in the mashed potatoes is moving. I was like, somebody overdid it with that, but... And they have wings. The pepper has wings. And it's moving a little bit. Those are flies. There's flies in the mashed potatoes. Just stir them up. Just stir them up. Don't say anything to anybody. Just stir them up. They will think it's pepper. They will think it's pepper. Is that wise or foolish? Just seeing whose house I want to eat at, you know what I'm saying? Because if you're like, it's okay, you got some problems, right? Just a little bit. You're like, it doesn't look like they're a bowl of Oreo ice cream. It's just a little bit of dead flies in the mashed potatoes. No, it's not okay, is it? So there's certain folly and certain ridiculousness in our lives that it's just a little bit of it just destroys the whole thing, doesn't it? Just a few dead flies in something. One commentator says it's easier to make a stink than create sweetness. In Solomon's illustration of a few dead flies and some ointment. So we need to guard against foolishness, particularly in regards to the things that we love so dearly. I mentioned marriage. We need to not demean our spouses. We need to protect their reputation around other people. Speak highly of them. Because there's just little cracks that are exposed in comments we make. Just little cracks. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's something. Solomon says here in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 that something that's maybe it's nothing can absolutely destroy everything. So if something's precious, like ointment here in the passage, whatever you hold dear needs to not have any folly in it. You'll destroy what you've built in your wisest days with your most foolish moments. So whatever's precious, whatever that ointment is, right, needs to be guarded, needs to be enjoyed, because a little bit of folly will pollute it. Verse 2 adds that foolishness is the opposite. This foolishness that we're talking about here is the opposite of wisdom. He says, the wise heart leans to the right and the fool's to the left. So this isn't, he didn't know anything about our politics. What this is a Hebrew idiom for the wrong direction. So this foolishness, with what we hold precious, takes one in the wrong direction. It's the wrong direction. And it's evident, it comes to the light. This foolishness shows itself. Verse 3 says that fools reveal themselves, even if unintentionally. So very few people that you meet, when you introduce them, I said very few, none of them goes, hi, I'm Rob. I'm the biggest fool you met today. But yet, foolishness shows itself. It shows itself. Their words and actions shout it. Wisdom also shows itself. Verse 4, when it talks about when someone in authority rages at you, you don't storm off or escalate it. So we're talking about foolishness in relationships, and this is an authority structure beginning in verse 4, talking about an anger of a ruler. If an anger of a ruler rises against you in verse 4, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. So Solomon's tying different examples about how wisdom and folly show themselves. And in verse 4, things get heated. Let's apply this to you. Your boss is mad at you. That's a bad time. There's one angry, stressed out individual right there unloading on you. Let's take it up a notch, shall we? Let's make it worse. How could we make that worse? Math. Math makes it worse. In what way? Multiplication. Multiplication makes anger worse. So verse 4, there's an angry ruler that's ready to unload on you. What is the prescription? Don't make two of them. Don't make two of them. This applies in authority structures in governmental ways. This applies in marriage. Your spouse, angry, stressed out, unloading. How do you take that up a notch? You do the same. So what's worse than one angry person unloading? Two. So when you have a moment, if you have a moment like that, remember this verse, remember this moment, and remember this sentence. Keep the angry person at one. Keep the number of angry people at one. At one. Just one. Your boss comes in, they unload, they're angry. The anger of those that rule over you, verse 4, rises against you. Don't storm off. Verse 4. For calmness will lay great offenses to rest. So here's what's happening in verse 4. You have made them mad. Stay calm. And don't put two angry, red-faced people in the same room. That's two bombs with the fuse disappearing. Because what's happening here, he's telling us to trim ridiculousness out of our life. And the folly that we let pervades. So what's happening in verse 4, the folly of an angry ruler, he's saying, don't let it pervade to you. It's got to stay there. It can't be here. Because verses 9:13 through 10:3, folly pollutes. Beginning in verse 4, folly pervades. Folly pervades. And we see these illustrations here. And there's two of them. One is in verses 4 through 11. And the second one is in verses 16 and 17. What happens in verses 16 and 17, there is a woe that he issues. He says, woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Happy you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. So what happens in verse 4 is those with power, those with influence, they're angry. It is your job, because of the pervasive nature of folly, to let them be the only fool in the room. Now, I said that, but if in that moment of heatedness, you say you're the only fool in this room, then there'll be two. Then there'll be two fools in that room. If you let them know that they're a fool in the room, then now there's two, and you're the second one. So what happens here is the ruler is rising up against you, and he's telling us that we ought to trim ridiculousness and folly from our life because it pollutes and it goes everywhere, and he brings up anger and authority. And what's happening in verses 16 and 17, he says that there is a woe, the opposite of a blessing, to a land when a king is a child. When a king is a child. And we have known this to be true in our marriages, right? Particularly for husbands. I mentioned husbands who should be who is, whether good or bad, who is the head of the household. And that household goes better when the husband does not act like a child. The household goes better that way. The state goes better when the governor of that state acts like an adult. The country goes better when the president acts like an adult. All of these things go better when those who are given the authority that they have act with the maturity that the authority requires. Husbands, leaders, pastors, teachers, all of that. You see that pervasive nature of folly. And in marriage, like husbands, like we are the gatekeeper of a lot of folly. We are the gatekeeper of that. It comes in to us and it comes in through us. Because folly pervades. It pollutes whatever it touches, and what it touches something, it touches all kinds of things. What does it look like? Well, it looks like that in verse 4. It looks like what happens to you when you're angry and you're offended. The way that you respond. That's what the folly looks like, that I'm telling you that we got to trim. It looks like that in verse 4. Second, it looks like verses 16 and 17, when someone is put into authority and they act like a child. That's what it is. So you're like, I don't really know what you're talking. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen it. You might have done it. When the authority that you have is not accompanied by the maturity that's required. There. When the people in the room who are supposed to be grown-ups don't act like grown-ups. It's a problem for everybody. Because in that room, there's no grown-ups. Our country ought to be led by a grown-up. Our church ought to be led by grown-ups. Our family ought to be led by grown-ups. Children have their place, and it's not in leadership. It's not in leadership. And the problem with that is the folly that is in the heart of a child, as we see elsewhere in the scriptures, should be removed from the heart of the people that are in charge, because it pollutes and it pervades. And ultimately, it pains, it hurts, beginning in verses 8 and following. In verse 8, he talks about a guy digging a pit and falling into it, and a guy breaking through a wall to only find a snake on the other side. In other words, it knocks down what you're building. It hurts in those positions. You think you have success, and it comes back to bite you. So one pastor put it, folly is painful because it's kind of like trying to log with a butter knife. It wears yourself out, and there's nothing sharp in it. You see that in these descriptions here. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries a stone is built by them. He who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt, and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. So he's guarding against folly. So there's two thieves here. One is death. Death is certainly to come and to take from us. Folly drains from us while we're alive. Why? Because it spreads everything that it touches, and it touches and it pervades everything, and it hurts everything. It hurts everything. That's what he's talking about here. He gives us an example that back there in verse 10. Folly's like it's trying to cut with a dull knife. It's like trying to cut with a dull knife. And wisdom is sharpening the blade before you hack. In verses 12 through 14, this pain shows up in the words that we speak. A fool is definitely known by their words. Verse 12, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. So you could have a butter knife trying to cut down an oak tree. Somebody walks by and goes, that knife ain't the only thing that's dull. But what's more likely to happen, beginning in verses 12 through 14, is they hear what you say, and that's how they know you're a fool. They hear what you say, and that's how they know. The words of the fool consumes him, and the end of them is madness. Verse 14 says the fool talks a lot. It talks a lot. And yet doesn't know the future. A fool multiplies words, verse 14, though no man knows what it is to be. I don't know if we have any Office fans among us, but Michael Scott, that famous leader, says sometimes I start a sentence and I don't even know where it's going, but I just hope to find it out along the way. And that is quintessential folly in a sentence. You know you got to say something. You're not really sure of the content of what it is, but you'll just kind of figure it out as you go. And then you're in a ditch. That's danger. That's a dangerous way to live. In the next verse, he talks about the pain of foolishness, saying that the fool wears himself out working, but doesn't have any sense of direction. Verses 18 through 20, he tells us what's at stake in this. He says, if you're a fool, then your laziness can destroy your house. Meanwhile, in the next verse, bread and wine, food, the result of not being lazy, can improve your quality of life. And he says this strange thing. Money answers everything. You're not the lazy person who lets your house fall around you. You've worked and saved. You have some cash, and it is an adaptable resource, is what he's saying here. Because if you keep this in the context of the entire book, Solomon visited wealth, and he said that wealth is one of the things that gets erased on the whiteboard of your life by the eraser of death. So it is not where your meaning is to be found in your life. But here he proves another point, that if you are not lazy, then the money that you have is an adaptable resource. That's what he's saying. So if folly is this dangerous, you could be paralyzed by fear. You're like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to do anything. It's possible. Because what if we mess up? When I do something, quote Dwight Schrute, I think about it, is that something a fool would do? Because if it's something a fool would do, then I'm not going to do it. So we might be tempted to not do anything. Because there's not any meaning to be found down here, according to Ecclesiastes, up to this point, but yet there is a better way to live. He says this in chapter 11, verse 1, in a very curious statement. He says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. So what does this soggy bread have to do with anything? Because if you cast your bread on the waters, you don't want it back. Some of us said it's talking about foreign investing. There you go. It's probably not. But what it probably is talking about is taking a calculated risk. And we see that because of the next verse. Give a portion to 7 or 8, or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. The context of the passage tells us he's talking about that there are risks and investments that we ought to be making. He's saying that there's two ways to spend this vapor of a life. You either do it wisely or foolishly, but there are risks that are absolutely wise because you are a fool to what the future may bring. So you can play a safe fool if you want to, but you probably shouldn't. Casting your bread on the waters might mean you don't get it back. Investing might mean you don't get it back. You cast your bread on the waters not knowing the future. You're ignorant to the future, you and I. We don't know. That's what he says in verse 2. You cast your bread, you invest in several things. You don't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. You diversify your funds. It's what you could do looking at this verse, because you don't know what disaster is going to happen down here. You should take risks while you can. Look at verse 3 and 4. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north in the place where the tree falls, there it will lay. So just like the clouds show up and pour themselves out, that's a natural consequence of a tree that's falling, that you can't move it, that there it is stuck. There are natural consequences for risks that we should have taken that we can no longer take. That's what he's talking about. He continues the metaphor in verse 4 to say, if you look at the weather, you'll never plant. So if there's something that we should be doing in our life, here's how we know that we're procrastinating. If all the conditions have to be perfect before we move, verse 3 and 4 show us that we'll never move. We're never going to do it. We're never going to do it if everything has to be perfect for us to go. Because you and I both know that everything is never going to be perfect. And that there are things that we ought to be doing, risks that we ought to be taking, that we ought to be doing in imperfect circumstances, simply for the worth of what we're doing. That's what he's saying. There's things that we ought to do. And I don't know how you handle risk. I don't know how you take it. One of our children, we would take them swimming when they were real little, and one of them would jump at you before you knew they were coming. Before you wanted them to come. Whether ready or not, here they come. And then we had another kid. And that kid would look at their feet, look at you, look at their feet again, look around, look back at you. Just a lot of looking. I don't know which one you are. But he's saying that there are things that is worth us doing that perfect conditions will never be for us to do. That's what he's saying here. Solomon says if you observe the wind, you'll never put seed in the ground. But you and I both know if you don't put seed in the ground, you'll never eat. So if we wait till everything's perfect, it's never going to happen. Verses 5 and 6 say, just like there's a mystery of how a human life is created in a womb, you don't know what God is doing. You don't know what God is doing. Just like God puts children in the bellies of their mom, he does all kinds of things that we can't fathom and we don't understand. Solomon says, just like that mystery, we don't know what God is doing. Do you see the context of this? You're encouraged to risk, even though you don't know what God is doing. Your risk is to be tied to his working. That's what we get from this. You don't know timing. You don't know what God's working. You don't know what effects it'll produce. Notice verse 6. In the morning, sow your seed. In the evening, withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. In other words, don't hold back in your life. Don't hold back. God's doing things that you don't know, and you don't understand how things will turn out. You don't know what they're going to produce. What kind of risks am I talking about? Well, he's talking about a risk that's tied to God's doing. And what kind of thing is God doing in the world? Well, he's uniting all things in Jesus Christ. So what is the work of God? But the work of the gospel. And what is riskier than evangelism? You don't know what God is going to do. You do know that your risk ought to be tied to God's working. So An application from this passage could be that you share the gospel with someone. And the reason that you haven't shared the gospel with them thus far is because the perfect situation has not arisen. The perfect situation has not arisen. And what do we get from this passage? The perfect situation is not going to arise. It's never going to be there. If you wait for the perfect opportunity to share the gospel with this person that you're now thinking of, because you know that in your mind you're waiting for the opening, the perfect opening will not exist. But your risk in this world ought to be tied to the working of God. What a better way to risk than to put yourself out there with the gospel of Jesus Christ to someone who an undetermined amount of breaths later is on their way to ruin. That is what we can get from this passage. And why would we risk like that? Because God has moved first. God has acted first. God has worked first. Because God is holy and perfect and righteous and just. He's perfect in all of His ways, and He's perfect in all of His deeds, and He dwells in inapproachable light, and He made us all in His image. But He made us in the image of God. In the image of God, He created them male and female. And our first parents, Adam and Eve, spit in the face of their Creator by the way that they lived. They sinned against God, they rebelled against God, and they went away from God. And what did God do to them in their folly? God became a man to redeem His creation by entering into it Himself in the person of Jesus Christ, who He is the power of God and the wisdom of God. If you've ever wanted to know what wisdom is, it is Jesus Christ walking among us. And He lived the one and only life that you and all your folly should have lived. He had no folly in Him. He was the wisdom of God. And He died on the cross for your sin. For everything you've done against God was placed upon Him. He died in the place of sinners. 3 days later, He rose up from the grave, alive after death. And because He's alive, He now speaks. Still. And what is the message of Jesus Christ for sinners? Well, it's the same as the first one He came preaching in the book of Mark. He said, repent and believe. Turn from the way you're living and cast yourself upon me. That's what He commands. And He offers to forgive you for everything you've done against God and grant you everlasting life with Him. If you're not a Christian, I'd love to talk to you about this up there, down here, anywhere. Come get me, and we'll talk about that. If you are a Christian, Mr. T pities the fool, and that's wise. Solomon tells you not to be him. Not to be him. And the folly that he highlights here in this text is you playing it safe when you ought to be risking because of the work of God. And why do we call it, why is it risking? Because you don't know what God will do. But who I'm talking to right now knows what obedience looks like. Because they've read it in the Scriptures. And they've applied it to their life. And they know the role that they should be playing in the work of God and His causes in the world. And they know the neighbor who the gospel ought to go to, or the coworker that the gospel ought to go to. And believe me, there are reasons why we want to play it safe. Because we've been hurt. We've been hurt before. We've put it all out there and then wished we hadn't. We've put ourselves out there and then wished we hadn't. You see, we risk. There is risk in our lives. But there is no risk for God. God doesn't risk anything. He rules and He reigns. And He's worthy of all of our risks. We talked about death last week, and in our small group, you realize in the first that there's going to be a you. There's going to be a you, a version of you. I promise you this person will exist one day. And this person, unless the Lord returns, this person will be on a deathbed, and they will look back on a life that you are currently now living, and there could be a regret that you wish you'd risked more for the all-consuming worth of God with the life that He's given you. The reason we would risk is because God works. The reason we should risk is because God is worthy. He's worthy. Your life isn't for you, it's for Him. So let's join the words of Solomon in risking our lives obediently and with the gospel from the neighborhood to the nations. Let's pray. Father, we need your help to discern what the right risks are with our lives, for there's folly in a lot of the safety that we try to hide in. I pray for those among us, specifically that are dealing with this question of what obedience looks like, what utilization of their gifts looks like in the church, that they take a step with their one foot, followed by the step of another foot, because you are worthy of pouring our lives out for. So, Father, I pray that you would show your worth to us all, that we might obey, that we might risk, that we might take the gospel places, that we should take it because you are worth it. In Jesus' name, amen.